I think I have all my supplies here. Listen, if you keep crested geckos, if you breed crested geckos, if you breed any kind of geckos at all, this might be the most important video you're going to watch. We're going to cover everything you need to know about raising these geckos. I'll put the challenge out there. If I don't cover a question that you have about raising crested geckos, leave a comment below and let me know. Also, watch to the end because I cover some very heavy topics and very controversial topics at the end. So let's see if this answers all of your questions. First of all, I want to throw a quick shout out to Megan Schmidt of Animal House and Brandon Fowler of Roaming Reptiles. Thanks for the mention on Facebook. I want to mention again that this video is specific to crested geckos from birth all the way up to about 2 months of age. But a lot of the information that we'll cover today also applies to gargoyle geckos and also applies to leopard geckos and any type of gecko that you're keeping. Finally, rather than rambling on about crested gecko baby care, I'm going to organize this video in a question and answer format just to keep things organized. So let's start. Question 1. Should I keep 2 babies from the same hatch in the same enclosure, and how long should I keep them in there? As you know, crested gecko females usually lay 2 eggs at a time. Those 2 eggs usually take about 60 days, give or take a few days, depending on temperatures, to hatch. Once those 2 eggs hatch, you have a decision to make. Should I keep the 2 babies together or keep them separate? It really depends on you. I'll tell you what we do. We keep those 2 babies together for the first about 5 to 6 weeks. And we do that so that we can monitor those 2 babies together and feed together. It just minimizes our maintenance efforts. I've heard some people say that there could be some tail issues where one gecko will attack the other gecko and take off the tail of the crested gecko. I've never, ever seen that kind of a problem with our animals. At about 5 to 6 weeks, we then separate those 2 animals into 2 separate containers. This will allow both of those animals to get the right amount of food for each one of them. Question number 2. How much should my crested gecko baby weigh when it's hatched out? Here at Supreme Gecko, we don't weigh any of our crested gecko babies. It's just not that important to us. They all hatch out at about the same size. Now I know that size is about 1.5 grams to 2 grams. I'll talk about sexing crested geckos a little bit later in the video, but for us, we really don't start weighing until we start checking for the sexes of the crested geckos. Question number 3. How big of a container should I use for my baby crested gecko when it's first hatched? Generally, we like to use a container like this. This is a nice critter keeper. And this is, I believe it's about 4 to 6 quarts. We'll also use, put that guy down gently, we'll also use any kind of a Tupperware container. This is 24 cups. If you use a Tupperware container, make sure you drill out the holes for ventilation. We drill on the sides and the top. Here's a video showing how we drill those holes out. This drill is, I believe, a 1.5 inch hole. The bit is commonly used for drilling door holes. I'm real fortunate that this drill is going through this plastic super easy. My absolute favorite container, though, is a little 6-quart Tupperware container. Again, plenty of holes on the top. Usually we have some holes on the side as well. But this is the perfect size of a container for 2 baby crested geckos to about 5 to 6 weeks of age. Now, a lot of times you'll hear on social media that you shouldn't use a large container for crested geckos because they won't find their food. I'm of the opinion that that's not the issue, that you shouldn't use a large container. I'm not saying to use a large container like a 10-gallon aquarium or larger. I am advocating to use a smaller enclosure like this. But it's not because I don't feel that it's not because they can't find their food. The reason that we use small containers is so that we can manage those animals better. And what does that mean? We want to make sure when the crested geckos are small that they're drinking and they're eating. If you have a small crested gecko in a 10-gallon enclosure, it's hard to find that crested gecko and it's certainly hard to find their poop. We find their poop to make sure that they're eating. And here's another reason to use a small container. Think of these animals in the wild. If they're in a big container, that means there's a lot of space. A lot of space means that there's big predators around them. In a small container like this, they feel more contained and they feel more secure away from predators. So that's why we use smaller containers. Question number 4. What kind of decor should I use in the enclosure? This is one of my favorite topics to talk about because there's 2 different ways to approach this. The first way is making a nice decorative enclosure for your baby crested gecko. Let's take this critter keeper as an example. You can use plastic plants. You can use little hides. I like this one because there's an opening at the top. You can put water in. That water leaches out and adds humidity to the enclosure. You can add cork bark. You can add other hides like this upside down plant saucer with a little notch in it. You can do whatever you want with these enclosures. And I'm going to talk about the substrate in just a moment. Here's how we do our enclosures for the small crested geckos. We take a tub like this. We take a paper towel. We wad it up. We put it in the corner. We put 1 piece of hide in here. This is just a top of an egg carton, styrofoam egg carton that's cut in half. It gives them plenty of hiding space. We put that hide right over that paper towel, and that's all that we do. At this point, you're probably asking why we don't have a substrate, and I'm going to cover that in another question in just a minute. Question number 5. How warm should the enclosure be, and how humid should the enclosure be? Let's talk about warmth first. That enclosure should be around 70 to 80 degrees. There's all kinds of ways to warm a plastic tub like this, but let me warn you about one thing. This is a small enclosure. Any kind of warmth that you add, it's going to be hard for those geckos to regulate their temperatures. If it's warm on one side, it's probably going to be warm on the other. I really strongly advise not to use any kind of a light bulb over an enclosure like this, especially the critter keepers. That seems like a great idea, but what you'll find is that there's just no room here for the gecko to get away from how hot that could be. And a light bulb can make this enclosure too warm quickly. If you have questions about how to warm a small enclosure like this, please leave a comment below, and I'll talk about that in a separate video. Let's talk about humidity. At this point, you're probably asking, what should the humidity be in an enclosure like this? To be very honest, I've never measured the humidity in enclosures like this. I just don't. It's hard to measure an area like this. I have hygrometers. I never ever use them. So what's right for the gecko? For a critter keeper cage like this, you can put a paper towel down on the bottom and then mist this enclosure about once a day or so. And that humidity should be enough for this whole enclosure and for this crested gecko. You might remember though that I use these Rubbermaid containers. And I don't use paper towel. You certainly can, and I'll tell you why I don't use the paper towel as a substrate or on the bottom in just a moment again. But what we do is, if you remember, we use that crumpled paper towel. And we put that under the hide. Every day we go in and we mist the hide, but we especially mist that paper towel. There's many times I'll find the crested geckos hidden in the paper towel, in the little crevices in the paper towel. That's how they get their humidity. It's not so much the air humidity, but it's being in direct contact with this paper towel that they get hydrated. I want to mention something about the temperature again. The cooler the temperature, the slower the animal will grow. There's several different factors involved in how quick your crested gecko will grow. One of them is the temperature or heat. Another is how much food you feed them. And a third is genetics. So if a crested gecko is kept in the 70s, it'll certainly grow slower than one that's kept in the high 70s to 80. That could be a huge factor in their growth. That was actually question 5 and 6, temperatures and humidities. Now on to question 7. Does my crested gecko need lights? My standard answer for this, for babies and for adults, is the same. Lights certainly can't hurt. They certainly need a light cycle. They need to have light during the day and darkness during the night. Now, does that mean direct lighting or indirect lighting? We provide all of our crested geckos indirect lighting on a light cycle of about 10 to 12 hours in the summer, spring and summer and fall. In the fall, we turn that light cycling down to about 8 hours a day or so. You might also have a question, should my crested gecko have UVB lighting? My answer to that again is there might be a benefit to UVB lighting, and it certainly doesn't hurt providing UVB lighting. Question number 8. Should I wait until after my crested gecko baby has shed first before I feed them? I've seen this question many, many times on social media, and I just don't understand the question. I'm not sure why you don't feed immediately. You're not really using that much food, and why get out of that cycle of feeding them every other day? Feed them right away. If they don't eat, it's not that big of a deal. Question number 9. Should I only feed crested gecko diet to my baby and not insects? This is a really, really interesting question, one of my favorites that I've seen on social media. When confronted with questions like this, you should always ask, what happens in nature? The crested gecko diet, and it doesn't really matter which diets we're talking about here, but the crested gecko diet is a supplement to the crested gecko's normal diet, which should include insects. I'm a big, big believer in feeding, especially baby crested geckos, insects. There's a huge benefit in their growth when you feed insects over the crested gecko diet. Even the crested gecko diets that include insects in their ingredients. So you would think my answer then would be you should feed insects as soon as you possibly can. And I agree with that, but here's what we do. We feed the crested gecko diet initially, and we continue to feed that crested gecko diet only and without insects for about 3 weeks or so. And the reason we do that is so that we can monitor those animals and make sure that absolutely they're eating the crested gecko diet. Once we're at those 3 weeks, I start pounding those crested gecko babies with insects. Question 10. Can I only feed the crested gecko diet, and do I have to feed insects? The easy answer to that question is you don't have to feed insects. They'll be okay on the crested gecko diet, especially the newer diets that include insects in their ingredients. Again, if you remember, I said that there's 3 different factors that impact the crested gecko's growth rates. 1 is temperature, 2 is foods, and 3 is genetics. By providing more insects to their diet, it really helps them grow significantly faster. For a breeder like myself, I'll make the comment that I don't want my crested gecko babies growing abnormally quickly. But I will say that we want our crested gecko babies to be as healthy as they possibly can be. Again, this is a 3/4 inch mealworm. And I love these mealworms because they start wriggling around, and there's nothing that this crested gecko can do other than eat it. Again, gecko fans, this is a 3/4 inch adult mealworm. And this crested gecko is just under 2 months of age and having no problems whatsoever eating this mealworm. I would rather feed 2 or 3 of these mealworms this size than 6 to 8 small mealworms. Question number 11. What insect should I feed my crested gecko baby? This is my favorite question of the whole session. The primary first insect foods of most crested geckos is crickets. As a breeder, we don't feed crickets, and you're going to be surprised at this, we don't feed crickets until crested geckos are at least sub-adult size. So what do we feed instead? We feed a myriad of live foods But we start our crested geckos out on mealworms and baby roaches. So why do we feed mealworms and dubia roaches? Because they're slower than crickets. If you've ever seen a cricket in a small enclosure, the first thing that they do is jump around all over the place. A baby crested gecko will watch that and eventually just give up on chasing that cricket around. But place a mealworm in front of that crested gecko, watch that mealworm squirm around and around. That crested gecko has no other option rather than jumping on that mealworm and eating it. So again, once those crested geckos are around 3 weeks or so, we start feeding mealworms. And then shortly after that, we start feeding dubias, baby dubias, of course. And we'll start feeding at least 2 times a week live insects. Question number 12. When should I feed my crested gecko babies and how often? This applies to crested gecko adults as well. We feed every other day, especially the babies. Sometimes in the winter, we'll skip a day with the adult crested geckos, but the babies get fed every other day. We generally prepare the diet at night, about an hour or 2 before lights go out, because they are nocturnal. They feed better at night. They're more active at night. And we feed that diet, again, every other day. If we're not feeding the diet, we're feeding live insects. Question number 13, the lucky number. How do I know if my crested gecko is eating? It's such a small amount that you're feeding your crested gecko baby. It's only the size of their head. How can you tell that they're eating that food? Well, the easy answer, and I've said this for years and years and years, is if your gecko is pooping, it's eating. Remember how I said that you should keep your crested geckos in a small enclosure? That's exactly why. You want to be able to look in that enclosure and right away tell if your crested gecko is pooping or not. You want to be able to find that poop real quick. To be very honest, and I've bred crested geckos now for about 15 years or more, and I've bred hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, thousands of crested gecko babies. Of all of those babies, I've had one that would not take the crested gecko diet. Again, I see this question on social media all the time. My baby crested gecko isn't eating its diet. And I love helping people that have questions about their crested gecko babies. But believe me, crested gecko babies eat. That's what they do. And this diet, especially the Pangea, is made specifically for their feeding response, to get them to eat as much as they possibly can. On that same regard, when I prepare the crested gecko diet for babies, I generally prepare it just like I do the adults. You want to make it like a runny milkshake, like eggnog, if you can picture that. Question number 14. How long can I hold my crested gecko baby? And that relates to a lot of people asking if they should hold their crested gecko baby because it seems like their crested gecko is just jumping all over the place. It seems like they're too excited. And I can tell you that for us, we never hold crested gecko babies until at least 2 weeks old. And we do that so that there's no stress levels whatsoever for these crested gecko babies. We want them feeding and growing and getting used to their enclosure as quickly as possible. Once they're about 2 weeks old, we'll handle them for about a minute or so every other feeding just to get used to that handling process. And again, when they're small, they are going to jump all over the place. They're just like kids. They have all kinds of energy. These guys are just full of energy when they're young. They like to jump. That's what they do. You can handle them, give them a target all the time. Give them somewhere where they can jump. After a while, they'll tire themselves out and they'll start walking instead of jumping, just like this one here. It's super, super important though, when you're handling them, that you handle them over some soft area so that if they do fall, they have somewhere soft to land. I've talked about most of the general care issues with crested gecko babies. Let's jump into some more heavier issues, some controversial issues, and let's cover those. Question number 15. If my Crested Gecko baby is born with a defect, what should I do? By defect, what I mean is that if it's missing a paw, if it has some kind of an underbite, if there's an issue with the tail. This is a really, really difficult topic, and it's one that even I'm a little bit, it's a little bit hard for me to talk about as well. These deformities do happen. It's very, very, very rare, but they do happen. And I just wanted to mention that if you have a deformity, and again, with thousands of Crested Gecko babies hatching, I've never had a deformity, luckily. But if you do have one, it's really a tough call. If it's such a deformity that it's going to impact that gecko's life, the quality of that gecko's life, then you might need to make a decision to euthanize that Crested Gecko, unfortunately. If it's an issue that doesn't impact that Crested Gecko's life, I'm all for taking care of that Crested Gecko as best as you possibly can. It might take a little bit more TLC, but these Crested Geckos certainly are worth the F to do that. Very tough question to answer. But I've had this question several times from email and direct messages from social media. Question number 16. What if my Crested Gecko baby escapes? These guys are small. They'll find small crevices in their enclosures to get out. They just will. So preventative measures should be taken initially so they don't have a way to escape. But I understand how lids can be left ajar and geckos can get out. My suggestion to that is find out right away if that Crested Gecko is out of the enclosure or not. The quicker you can respond to that missing Crested Gecko, the better. The very first thing that you should do is look in the general area. Look under things. Look on top of things. Crested geckos like to crawl up, so look high. Look at the tops of curtains. Look on top of the TV. You'll find them occasionally on top of a book rack, on top of the books. Look high. So that's the first place. The second place is look low. Look under a couch. Look under something that's in the general. I've had Crested Geckos escape occasionally because of little spaces in the tubs and the racks that I use. It hasn't happened that often, but generally when I'm missing a Crested Gecko, 90% of the time, I find that baby on the same rack, somewhere on that rack. They don't like to crawl a long way from where they're at. If you can start looking for that Crested Gecko within the first few hours, within the first day of it going missing, you have a really, really good chance of finding that. As far as leaving water and food out, I think that could help, but the effort really should be put into looking as hard as you can for that Crested Gecko, especially within the first 24 hours. Question number 17, and this will be our last question. Again, if you have other questions, I might be surprised because I'm hoping that I've covered everything as much as I possibly can here. But if you have other questions, leave those questions down in the comments and I'll get to those as soon as I possibly can. For question number 17 though, I get this a lot in emails and direct messages. When can I start sexing my Crested Gecko baby? This is really a tough one because I know people want to know if that Crested Gecko is going to be a male or female as soon as they possibly can. So I think what people are expecting is an answer like at 4 months or at 5 months, you should be able to check to see if it's a male or a female. I really don't start looking here at Supreme Gecko until about 5 to 6 months. We sell our Crested Geckos at about 2 months of age, and I sell them as unsexed. At 5 to 6 months, we start looking, when we're ready to sell the Crested Geckos, we start looking for the pores on the Crested Geckos, and if we see the pores, we'll pull them out and we'll mark them as males. If it doesn't have pores, I definitely don't mark them as females, and I don't actually mark them as females until around the 9 to 10 months of age, when I can tell for sure that it's, for as much as I can tell, that it's a female. So my general answer to questions like that is that you can start looking at about 5 to 6 months if you really know what to look for in sexing crested geckos to see if it might be a male. You're not, though, going to be guaranteed that it's not a male until around 10 to 11 months of age, when you can get a pretty good feel that it's not going to be a male. And again, I see on social media many times crested geckos for sale at 4 or 5 months of age as definite females, and I'll guarantee that there's not a way to tell for sure, 100% sure, that it's a female at that age. Well, I certainly hope if you keep crested geckos, if you're considering breeding, if you're already breeding, if you've been breeding for several years, I hope that this video offered some helpful tips to you to help you raise your animals just a little bit better. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, hit that like button for me, please. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification, and thank you very much for watching.